Confessor, the Holy King of England. Welcome to this exploration of one of medieval England's most fascinating monarchs, Edward the Confessor. In the pantheon of English kings, few figures bridge the gap between the Anglo-Saxon world and the Norman conquest, quite like Edward. Reigning from 1042 to 1066, he was the last great Anglo-Saxon king before the Norman invasion that would forever change England's destiny. Edward earned his epithet, the Confessor, not through martyrdom, but through his reputation for exceptional piety and devotion to the Christian faith. Unlike many medieval rulers remembered primarily for their military conquests or political machinations, Edward is remembered for his spiritual devotion, his role in rebuilding Westminster Abbey, and ironically, for the succession crisis that his childless reign created, ultimately leading to the Battle of Hastings in 1066. Tonight, we'll journey through Edward's remarkable life, from his exile in Normandy as a young prince, through his unexpected rise to the throne, his complex relationships with powerful Anglo-Saxon nobles, his deep religious conviction, and finally, his death and the chaos that followed. This is the story of a king who sought to rule through divine authority rather than the sword, and whose legacy would shape England for centuries to come. Our story begins around 1003, when Edward was born into one of the most turbulent periods in English history. He was the son of Ethelred the Unready, a king whose very nickname speaks not to his ineffectual rule, but that he was ill-advised by senior members of his court, and Emma of Normandy, a marriage alliance that would prove prophetic for England's future. Edward's early years were marked by constant Viking raids and political instability. The Danish king Sweyn Forkbeard and later his son Canute were systematically conquering English territory, and Ethelred's kingdom was crumbling. In 1013, when Edward was barely 10 years old, his family was forced into exile as Sweyn Forkbeard claimed the English throne. The family fled to Normandy to the court of Emma's brother, Duke Richard II. This exile would last nearly 3 decades and fundamentally shape Edward's character and world-view. In Normandy, Edward was exposed to continental European culture, Norman administrative practices, and most importantly, a more structured and ritualized form of Christianity than what he had known in England. The Norman court was sophisticated, with strong ties to the church and a developing feudal system that was more organized than the Anglo-Saxon model. Edward absorbed these influences during his formative years. He learned French, studied Latin extensively, and developed the deep religious conviction that would define his later reign. The Norman preference for strong ecclesiastical hierarchy and elaborate religious ceremony would later manifest in Edward's own kingship. During these exile years, Edward also formed crucial relationships with Norman nobles who would later play significant roles in his reign. Most importantly, he developed a close relationship with his cousin, William, who would later become Duke of Normandy and, eventually, William the Conqueror. When Canute died in 1035, England descended into a succession crisis. Edward's half-brother, Harthacnut, eventually claimed the throne, but his reign was brief and unpopular. The Anglo-Saxon nobility, tired of Danish rule and heavy taxation, began to look toward the old royal line for legitimate leadership. In 1041, Harthacnut invited Edward back to England, possibly as a political gesture to placate the Anglo-Saxon nobles. This return after 28 years of exile must have been overwhelming for Edward, He was returning to a country he barely remembered, to speak a language that was no longer his mother tongue, and to navigate a complex political landscape dominated by powerful Anglo-Saxon earls who had grown accustomed to significant autonomy. The most powerful of these earls was Godwin of Wessex, who controlled the largest and wealthiest earldom in England. Godwin had been instrumental in supporting Danish rule, but was pragmatic enough to recognize the shifting political winds. When Harthacnut died suddenly in 1042, Godwin threw his considerable support behind Edward's claim to the throne, seeing an opportunity to maintain his own power through a potentially malleable king. Edward's accession to the throne in 1042 was far from assured. Despite his legitimate bloodline, England in the 11th century was not an absolute monarchy where primogeniture guaranteed succession. Kings needed the support of powerful nobles, and Edward had been absent for nearly 3 decades. His crowning at Winchester Cathedral on April 3rd, 1043, was both a triumph and the beginning of a delicate balancing act. Edward inherited a kingdom that was ethnically and culturally divided. The Anglo-Saxon nobility maintained their traditional power structures, while significant Danish populations remained, particularly in the Danelaw regions of northern England. There were also established Norman influences, especially in the church hierarchy. Godwin of Wessex was instrumental in Edward's coronation, but this support came with expectations. In medieval politics, such alliances were often sealed through marriage, and Godwin had a daughter, Edith, who was of marriageable age. The political pressure for this union was enormous, and in 1045 Edward married Edith, cementing his alliance with the House of Godwin, but also binding himself to a family whose interests didn't always align with his own. This marriage reveals one of the central tensions of Edward's reign. While he needed Godwin's support to maintain his throne, Edward was increasingly uncomfortable with Anglo-Saxon noble traditions that he viewed as crude compared to Norman sophistication. The marriage to Edith was political rather than romantic, and contemporary sources suggest it was never consummated. Whether due to Edward's alleged vow of celibacy or simply his lack of affection for his wife remains debated by historians. Edward's early reign was marked by his attempts to introduce Norman advisors and practices into the English court. He appointed Robert of Normandy as Bishop of London and later as Archbishop of Canterbury, bypassing English candidates. He invited Norman nobles to court and granted them positions of influence. These appointments created significant tension with Anglo-Saxon nobles who saw their traditional privileges being eroded. The king's religious devotion became evident almost immediately. Edward spent considerable time in prayer, attended multiple masses daily, and showed particular devotion to Saint Peter. This spirituality was genuine, but it also served a political purpose. It provided Edward with moral authority that compensated for his lack of military prowess or charismatic leadership. One of Edward's most significant early decisions was his commitment to rebuilding Westminster Abbey. The existing church was modest by continental standards, and Edward envisioned a magnificent Romanesque structure that would rival the great churches of Normandy and France. This project, which would consume enormous resources throughout his reign, reflected both his personal piety and his desire to create a physical symbol of legitimate English kingship that matched European standards. The rebuilding of Westminster Abbey was revolutionary for England. Edward imported Norman architects and craftsmen, introducing construction techniques and artistic styles previously unknown in England. The abbey would become his obsession, and he personally supervised many aspects of its construction. This project also served a political purpose. It was located adjacent to the royal palace at Westminster, creating a sacred space that legitimized royal authority through divine association. Edward's governance style was markedly different from his predecessors. Where Anglo-Saxon kings traditionally ruled through personal relationships and warrior bonds with their nobles, Edward attempted to rule through divine authority and bureaucratic administration learned in Normandy. He relied heavily on written documentation, formal ceremonies, and ecclesiastical approval for his decisions. However, this approach created practical problems. The Anglo-Saxon earls expected direct access to their king and consultation on major decisions. They were accustomed to a more egalitarian relationship with royal authority. Edward's more formal, hierarchical approach was seen as foreign and sometimes insulting to noble dignity. The king's court became increasingly cosmopolitan during this period, with Norman French being spoken alongside Anglo-Saxon. Edward himself was more comfortable in French and Latin than in English, which created communication barriers with many of his subjects. This linguistic divide was symbolic of the deeper cultural tensions that would define his reign. Chapter 3. The most dramatic political crisis of Edward's reign erupted in 1051, fundamentally testing both his authority and his relationship with the most powerful noble family in England. The conflict with Godwin of Wessex and his sons would ultimately define Edward's capabilities as a king and reveal the complex dynamics of 11th century English politics. The crisis began with a seemingly minor incident in Dover. Eustace II, Count of Boulogne and Edward's brother-in-law, through his mother Emma, was returning from a visit to the English court with his retinue. Contemporary accounts describe how Eustace's men attempted to secure accommodation in Dover by force, leading to a violent confrontation with local townspeople. Several men were killed on both sides, creating a diplomatic incident that required resolution. Edward demanded that Godwin, as Earl of Wessex and thus responsible for Dover, punish the townspeople and compensate Eustace for the injuries to his men. This demand placed Godwin in an impossible position. To comply would anger his own people and suggest that foreign nobles had superior rights to English townsmen. To refuse would constitute direct defiance of royal authority. Godwin's refusal to carry out Edward's orders provided the king with an opportunity he had long sought, a chance to challenge the overwhelming power of the Godwin family. Edward summoned the assembly of Anglo-Saxon nobles to address Godwin's defiance. This was a calculated political gambit that would test whether Edward could command the loyalty of the broader nobility against the most powerful earl in the kingdom. The king had prepared carefully for this confrontation. He had quietly secured the support of Leofric of Mercia and Siward of Northumbria, the other great earls who had grown weary of Godwin's dominance. He also positioned Norman allies in key positions and may have promised them English lands if the confrontation succeeded. The political dynamics became clear. Godwin arrived with a substantial armed force, as did his sons Harold and Sweyn. However, they found themselves outnumbered by the combined forces loyal to Edward. The king's supporters included not only the Mercian and Northumbrian earls, but also significant numbers of Anglo-Saxon nobles who resented Godwin's power. The confrontation escalated when Edward made an unprecedented demand. He required Godwin and his sons to present themselves at court without their armed retinues, essentially demanding they place themselves at his mercy. When Godwin refused, Edward declared the entire family outlawed and gave them 5 days to leave England. This was a stunning reversal of fortune. The family that had dominated English politics for 2 decades was suddenly in exile. Godwin fled to Flanders with his wife and younger sons, while Harold escaped to Ireland. Their vast estates were redistributed among Edward's supporters, primarily Norman nobles who had accompanied him to England or arrived afterward. The year of Godwin's exile, from 1051 to 1052, represents the high point of Edward's independence as a king. Free from Godwin's influence, he accelerated the appointment of Norman administrators and clergy. Robert of Normandy was elevated to Archbishop of Canterbury, and several Norman nobles received significant English landholdings. The king's court became increasingly Norman in character, with French customs and language becoming more prominent. However, Edward's triumph was temporary. In 1052, Godwin returned with a considerable force, having spent his exile building alliances and preparing for restoration. His ships appeared in the English Channel, and his supporters began rallying throughout southern England. The political calculation had changed. Many Anglo-Saxon nobles, who had initially supported Edward against Godwin, now viewed the increasing Norman influence as a greater threat than Godwin's power. The crisis reached its peak when Godwin's fleet sailed up the Thames to London. Edward found himself in an impossible military position with insufficient loyal forces to resist, and the very real possibility of civil war. The king was forced to negotiate, and the terms of Godwin's restoration were humiliating for royal authority. Godwin and his family were fully restored to their previous positions and estates. More significantly, almost all of Edward's Norman appointees were dismissed and forced to leave England. Robert fled to Normandy, and the Norman nobles who had received English lands during Godwin's exile were dispossessed. The resolution of the Godwin crisis fundamentally altered the trajectory of Edward's reign. While he remained king, his practical authority was significantly diminished. Godwin's son, Harold, emerged from these events as the dominant political figure in England, eventually becoming Earl of Wessex upon his father's death in 1053. This political defeat had profound implications for Edward's character and governance. He became increasingly withdrawn from day-to-day political affairs, focusing more intensively on his religious devotions and the construction of Westminster Abbey. Some historians argue that this period marked Edward's psychological retreat from active kingship as he realized the limitations of his power against determined noble opposition. The crisis also had international implications. The expelled Norman nobles carried tales of their treatment back to Normandy, where Duke William began to view Edward's position as weak and potentially exploitable. The seeds of future Norman claims to the English throne were planted during this period of political upheaval. Following his political defeat in the Godwin crisis, Edward increasingly turned his attention to spiritual matters, earning the devotion that would eventually lead to his canonization. His religious practices went far beyond the conventional piety expected of medieval monarchs, encompassing a personal spirituality that shaped both his daily life and his his understanding of kingship. Edward's daily routine revolved around religious observance. Contemporary chronicles describe a king who attended multiple masses, spent hours in private prayer, and maintained what appeared to be a vow of celibacy even within his marriage to Edith. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle notes that he often spent entire nights in prayer before important decisions, seeking divine guidance in ways that his more pragmatic nobles found excessive. His spiritual devotion manifested in remarkable acts of charity and mercy. Edward regularly performed the ritual of washing the feet of poor pilgrims, personally distributed alms to the needy, and established hospitals and religious institutions throughout his kingdom. These actions weren't merely political gestures. Contemporary accounts suggest genuine spiritual motivation behind his charitable works. The king's most famous religious practice was his alleged ability to perform miraculous healings through the royal touch. Medieval sources describe numerous instances where Edward cured scrofula, a tubercular infection of the lymph nodes, by simply laying his hands upon sufferers. While modern historians approach these claims with skepticism, the belief in Edward's healing powers was widespread and contributed significantly to his reputation for sanctity. However, it was Edward's rebuilding of Westminster Abbey that served as the supreme expression of his religious devotion and his most lasting contribution to English history. When he ascended the throne, Westminster possessed only a modest church, but Edward envisioned a magnificent Romanesque structure that would serve as both a spiritual centre and a symbol of legitimate English monarchy. The new abbey was revolutionary in English architecture. Edward imported master builders from Normandy who introduced construction techniques previously unknown in England. The church featured massive stone columns, elaborate carved capitals, and extensive use of the round arch characteristic of Romanesque style. The scale was unprecedented. The nave was longer than any existing English church, and the overall design rivaled the great continental abbeys. Construction began around 1050 and consumed enormous resources throughout Edward's reign. The project required the quarrying and transport of vast quantities of stone, the recruitment of skilled artisans from across Europe, and the allocation of approximately 1/10 of the kingdom's annual revenue. This financial commitment demonstrates the project's importance to Edward. He was willing to strain royal resources to achieve his vision. The abbey's design served multiple purposes beyond spiritual devotion. Located adjacent to the royal palace at Westminster, it created a sacred space that legitimized royal authority through divine association. The church was dedicated to Saint Peter, reflecting Edward's particular devotion to the apostle, and was intended to house important royal ceremonies, including coronations. Edward personally supervised many aspects of the construction, visiting the site regularly and involving himself in architectural details. Contemporary accounts describe a king who understood masonry techniques, consulted with master builders about structural problems, and insisted on the highest quality materials and craftsmanship. This hands-on involvement was unusual for a medieval monarch and reflects the project's personal significance to Edward. The abbey also served as Edward's intended burial place, though he would die just days after its consecration in 1065. The timing was seen by contemporaries as divinely ordained. Edward lived just long enough to see his great work completed before ascending to what many believed was immediate sainthood. Edward's religious reputation extended beyond England during his lifetime. European consistently supported church reform movements, appointed learned and pious bishops, and worked to eliminate simony and clerical marriage from English ecclesiastical life. His appointments to high church offices were generally based on merit and religious devotion rather than political considerations. Edward's religious practices sometimes created tension with traditional Anglo-Saxon expectations of kingship. His pacifist inclinations, while admirable from a spiritual perspective, were problematic in an era when military leadership was considered essential to royal authority. His preference for prayer over warfare occasionally frustrated nobles who expected their king to lead personally in battle. The development of Edward's posthumous cult began almost immediately after his death. Within decades, stories of his sanctity spread throughout Europe, and formal efforts toward canonization commenced. Pope Alexander III canonized Edward in 1161, making him the first English king to achieve official sainthood. As Edward aged without producing an heir, the question of succession became the dominant political issue of his reign and ultimately determined the future of England. The childless marriage between Edward and Edith created a constitutional crisis that would culminate in the Norman conquest, making the succession question perhaps the most consequential aspect of Edward's legacy. The absence of a direct heir was not merely a personal failing, but a political catastrophe in medieval terms. Anglo-Saxon kingship, while not strictly hereditary, strongly favored direct descent, and the lack of royal children created unprecedented uncertainty about legitimate succession. Various claimants would eventually emerge, each with different bases for their claims, leading to the complex web of competing interests that exploded in 1066. Edward's relationship with his wife Edith remains one of the most puzzling aspects of his reign. Contemporary sources suggest the marriage was never consummated, though historians debate whether this was due to a religious vow of celibacy on Edward's part, political calculation, or simple personal incompatibility. Some chronicles describe Edward as having taken a private vow of chastity, viewing celibacy as essential to his spiritual calling. The political implications of this childless marriage extended far beyond personal disappointment. Godwin and his family had clearly expected that Edith would produce royal heirs, cementing their family's position for generations. The absence of children gradually shifted political dynamics, as it became clear that the succession would involve nobles outside the immediate royal family. During the 1050s, several potential successors emerged. The most obvious candidate was Edgar Etheling, Edward's great-nephew and the last direct male descendant of the Anglo-Saxon royal line. However, Edgar was born around 1051, making him a child throughout most of Edward's later reign. While Edgar had the strongest hereditary claim, his youth made him an impractical choice for immediate succession in an era when kings needed to provide immediate military and political leadership. Harold Godwinson, Earl of Wessex and Edith's brother, gradually positioned himself as another potential successor. Harold possessed no blood relationship to the royal family, but he had emerged as the most powerful nobleman in England following his father's death in 1053. His control of Wessex, military reputation, and political skills made him a formidable candidate, though his claim would rest on selection rather than hereditary right. The most complex and ultimately decisive claim came from across the English Channel. William, Duke of Normandy, was Edward's cousin through his mother, Emma, and had hosted Edward during his long exile. William would later claim that Edward had promised him the English throne, possibly during secret negotiations in the 1050s or early 1060s. The nature of any such promise remains historically controversial. William's supporters argued that Edward, grateful for Norman hospitality during his exile and preferring Norman governance, had formally designated William as his heir. Anglo-Saxon sources deny any such commitment, suggesting that William's claim was a later fabrication designed to justify invasion. If Edward did make such a promise, it would have been politically motivated. The king may have viewed William as a potential counterweight to Anglo-Saxon noble power, particularly the dominance of the Godwin family. A Norman succession would have broken the power of English earls while maintaining continuity with Edward's own continental connections and preferences. The situation became further complicated by Harold Godwinson's alleged oath to William. Norman sources claim that Harold, while shipwrecked on the Norman coast around 1064, swore on sacred relics to support William's claim to the English throne. Anglo-Saxon sources either deny this oath or suggest Harold had no choice but to agree under duress, making any such promise invalid. Edward's own actions regarding succession remain ambiguous. Contemporary sources suggest he was reluctant to name any successor definitively, perhaps hoping for divine intervention or unwilling to precipitate a civil war. His focus on spiritual matters may have made him reluctant to engage with the harsh realities of political succession. The king's final illness in late 1065 brought the succession crisis to a head. As Edward lay dying, the various claimants and their supporters began positioning themselves for the inevitable struggle. Harold Godwinson was present at court and well positioned to claim immediate recognition. William was across the Channel, requiring time to organize invasion forces if his claim were challenged. Edgar Etheling was still too young to command serious support. Edward's deathbed statements became a matter of crucial historical importance and contemporary debate. Norman sources claim he confirmed William's designation as heir, while Anglo-Saxon chronicles suggest he recommended Harold Godwinson to the assembled nobles. The absence of clear, uncontested documentation meant that each claimant could interpret Edward's final wishes to support their own position. The succession crisis that Edward's childless reign created would prove catastrophic for Anglo-Saxon England. Within a year of his death, the kingdom would face invasions from both Norway and Normandy, culminating in the Battle of Hastings and the end of Anglo-Saxon rule. In this sense, Edward's greatest political failure was also his most historically significant legacy. His inability to produce a clear succession led directly to the Norman conquest and the transformation of English civilization. Edward the Confessor died on January 5, 1066, just days after the consecration of his beloved Westminster Abbey. Contemporary accounts describe his final illness as lasting several days, during which he remained conscious and able to speak with the nobles gathered around his deathbed. His death would trigger the succession crisis that had been building throughout his childless reign and ultimately lead to one of the most consequential years in English history. The king's final moments were witnessed by his wife Edith, Harold Godwinson, and other members of the court. According to Anglo-Saxon chronicles, Edward's last coherent words recommended Harold to the assembled nobles as his successor. though Norman sources would later dispute this account. The ambiguity surrounding Edward's final wishes reflected the political uncertainty that had characterized the succession question throughout his later reign. Harold Godwinson moved quickly to secure the throne. On January 6, 1066, just one day after Edward's death, Harold was crowned King Harold II in the newly consecrated Westminster Abbey. This rapid coronation was politically necessary. In medieval succession crises, speed often determined legitimacy, and Harold needed to present the other claimants with a fait accompli. Edward was buried in Westminster Abbey before the high altar, in the sacred space his life's work had created. His tomb would quickly become a site of pilgrimage as stories of his sanctity spread throughout England and continental Europe. The placement of his burial site was symbolically appropriate. Edward was laid to rest in the church that represented both his greatest achievement and his deepest spiritual devotion. News of Edward's death and Harold's coronation reached William of Normandy by late January. William's response was immediate and decisive. He began preparing for invasion, claiming that Harold had violated his sacred oath and usurped a throne that Edward had promised to Normandy. William spent months gathering allies, securing papal support, and assembling one of the largest invasion fleets medieval Europe had ever seen. The Norman invasion fleet crossed the English Channel on September 28, 1066, landing at Pevensey in Sussex. Harold had been forced to march his army north to York to defeat a simultaneous Norwegian invasion led by Harold Hardrada, whom he defeated at Stamford Bridge on September 25th. The king then force-marched his exhausted troops south to face the Norman threat. The Battle of Hastings, fought on October 14, 1066, decided the fate of Anglo-Saxon England. Harold died in the battle, allegedly struck by an arrow through the eye, though the exact circumstances of his death remain disputed. William's victory was complete, and by Christmas Day, 1066, he was crowned King William I of England in Edward's Westminster Abbey. The Norman conquest fundamentally transformed English civilization. The Anglo-Saxon nobility was systematically replaced by Norman lords. The English language absorbed massive French vocabulary, and continental European cultural influences permanently altered English society. The governmental, legal, and ecclesiastical systems that Edward had tried to reform were completely replaced by Norman institutions. Edward's personal legacy was more complex. Within a generation of his death, he was widely regarded as a saint. Stories of his piety, miraculous healings, and prophetic visions spread throughout Europe. Pope Alexander III canonized him in 1161, and his feast day on October 13th became an important celebration in the English church calendar. Once the irony of Edward's legacy is profound, a king who sought to avoid warfare through spiritual devotion created the political vacuum that led to one of the most violent conquests in English history. His childless reign, which he may have viewed as spiritual dedication, directly caused the catastrophic succession crisis that destroyed Anglo-Saxon England. Yet Edward's contributions were also substantial and enduring. Westminster Abbey remained the coronation church for English monarchs for nearly 1,000 years. His reputation for justice and mercy provided a model for future English kings. Most importantly, his canonization created the only sainted English monarch, providing a uniquely English royal saint who embodied both temporal authority and spiritual devotion. Edward the Confessor's reign represents the end of an era in English history and the beginning of the political crisis that would reshape the British Isles forever. His His 24 years on the throne from 1042 to 1066 marked both the last flowering of Anglo-Saxon kingship and the gradual infiltration of continental European influences that would culminate in the Norman conquest. As we reflect on Edward's life and reign, we see a complex figure who defied simple categorization. He was neither the warrior king that Anglo-Saxon traditions celebrated, nor the administrative monarch that Norman practice would establish. Instead, he represented something unique in medieval kingship, a ruler who attempted to govern through moral authority and divine sanction rather than military might or political cunning. Edward's greatest achievement was undoubtedly his rebuilding of Westminster Abbey, which created a sacred space that legitimized English monarchy for nearly a millennium. Every English and British sovereign from William the Conqueror to Elizabeth II would be crowned in the church that Edward built, making his architectural vision one of the most enduring royal legacies in European history. His reputation for sanctity, while sometimes exaggerated by medieval chroniclers, reflected genuine spiritual devotion that set him apart from his contemporaries. In an age when kingship was typically associated with warfare and political ruthlessness, Edward provided an alternative model of royal authority based on Christian virtue and personal piety. His canonization in 1161 recognized this unique contribution to medieval concepts of sacred kingship. However, Edward's reign also demonstrated the practical limitations of governing through spiritual authority alone. His inability to manage the great nobles effectively, particularly the Godwin family, showed that medieval kingship required political skills that complemented religious devotion. His childless marriage, whether the result of spiritual vows or personal inclination, created the succession crisis that destroyed the kingdom he had tried to preserve. The Norman conquest that followed Edward's death represents one of history's great turning points. Within a generation, Anglo-Saxon culture was transformed. The English language was permanently altered, and the political structure of England was completely rebuilt along continental lines. Edward's failure to secure a clear succession was the immediate cause of this transformation. Yet perhaps Edward's most significant legacy was the preservation of Anglo-Saxon royal legitimacy through his sanctification. By becoming England's sainted king, Edward provided a bridge between the pre-conquest past and the post-conquest future. Norman and later monarchs could claim continuity with Edward's holy kingship while implementing their own governmental innovations. Edward the Confessor died as he had lived, in prayer, surrounded by the religious symbols that had defined his reign. His death on January 5, 1066, just days after the consecration of Westminster Abbey, seemed to contemporaries a divinely orchestrated conclusion to a life dedicated to spiritual service. Within months his kingdom would be transformed forever, but his personal legacy of sacred kingship would endure through the centuries. In the end, Edward the Confessor represents both the triumph and the tragedy of idealism in medieval politics. His genuine piety and spiritual devotion earned him sainthood and the lasting admiration of his subjects. Yet his inability to balance spiritual calling with political necessity created the very crisis that destroyed the Anglo-Saxon world he embodied. He remains a unique figure in English history, the last Anglo-Saxon king to rule through divine authority and the first English monarch to achieve official sainthood, a ruler whose greatest virtue was also one of his most significant political vulnerabilities. Thank you for joining us in this exploration of Edward the Confessor's remarkable life and enduring legacy. His story reminds us that individual character, however admirable, must be balanced with practical wisdom in the exercise of power, and that the most well-intentioned decisions can sometimes produce the most unforeseeable consequences, as we will soon see unfold.